Marrow Hall stood like a sentinel over the misted valley, its spires clawing at the low-hanging clouds, its stone walls blackened by centuries of wind and rain. Even in the bright light of midday, shadows pooled beneath the arches and in the corners of the sprawling estate. The townsfolk spoke of it only in whispers, calling it haunted, cursed, unnatural. Yet it was not ghosts that lived here. It was the bloodline itself, cruel, refined, unyielding. Lady Evangeline Marrow moved through the halls with the grace of a cat, each footfall silenced by velvet-lined carpets. Her black gown trailed behind her like a wisp of smoke, and her pale hands, clasped delicately around a porcelain teacup, hid the tremor that signaled anticipation, not fear. The portraits lining the walls seemed alive in the flickering candlelight, her ancestors' eyes glinting in accusation or challenge, each one frozen in paint yet somehow watching, waiting. The Marrow family had been cursed. Generations had amassed wealth and power by cruelty, greed, and deception. Ancestors had poisoned rivals, hoarded secrets, manipulated marriages, and betrayed allies. Evangeline, the last of the line, had grown up under the shadow of whispered stories, whispered warnings that blood could never wash away the sins of the past. Her governess had been the first to reveal the truth in hushed tones, her frail body trembling as she handed Evangeline a leather-bound ledger. Every Marrow has taken, deceived, and destroyed. You are the only one who can see it end, or continue. Evangeline had studied each page, tracing the inked names of the guilty with her fingers. Her mind wove the threads of justice, not in violence but in subtlety, in silence, in the deadly elegance that only a lady of her station could command. She understood that murder could be art, quiet, invisible, untraceable. A sip here, a bite there, a touch of shadow in the right moment. And so, she began to plan. By nightfall, she wandered the halls, candle in hand, listening to the wind's mournful song through cracked windows. Dust motes floated like tiny specters in the firelight. Her eyes, cold and calculating, fell on the first target, Cousin Ambrose, arrogant and cruel, a man who took pleasure in tormenting those weaker than himself. He would be the first to taste the consequences of generations of sin. The Marrow curse was not merely a story, it was a living, breathing shadow. Each family member carried it unknowingly, their arrogance and cruelty feeding it, keeping it alive. Evangeline had studied every detail of her ancestors' lives. She read letters, journals, and confessions hidden away in the attic. Some spoke of love turned sour, of fortunes stolen, of lives snuffed out quietly. Others were more sinister, detailing betrayals and secret dealings with men whose names were never spoken aloud, men who promised power in exchange for dark deeds. The wind howled through the corridors, rattling the windows as if the house itself were alive, aware of her intent. Evangeline stood before a portrait of her father, a man whose sharp eyes seemed to pierce through her very soul. She imagined his cruelty magnified, centuries of malice culminating in this very moment. The ledger of sins lay open on the desk. Every line, every name, was a thread in the web she intended to unravel. The servants whispered among themselves, fearful of the sudden deaths and illnesses that had begun to plague the family. Evangeline watched from the shadows as they moved about the halls, unaware that their mistress, elegant and composed, was orchestrating the fate of the household. The poison was subtle, a tincture here, a drop there, invisible to all who did not know what to look for. She spent hours in the library, tracing her fingers over the ink of ancestors who had cursed their own line. Justice, she whispered, the word tasting of iron and fire. Justice will be served. She allowed herself a quiet smile, feeling the thrill of anticipation coil like a serpent in her chest. Tonight, the first step would be taken. Dinner was set as though for a celebration. Candles flickered against crystal glasses, silver plates gleamed, and the smell of roasted meat mingled with the perfume of flowers that lined the long table. Ambrose laughed loudly, recounting tales of cruelty inflicted upon servants, of neighbors tricked and humiliated. Evangeline moved among them like a shadow, her step silent, her expression serene. She poured him a glass of vintage wine, its deep red catching the candlelight. The faint bitterness she added was imperceptible, a whisper of death in a perfect veneer of sophistication. Ambrose drank eagerly, unaware of the danger, his arrogance blinding him. By the time the servants cleared the plates, Ambrose was pale, sweating, hands trembling on the polished oak. Panic and confusion spread, but Evangeline's face remained a mask of calm elegance. She excused herself, retreating to the hallway, watching the poison take hold. Ambrose's eyes widened with horror, yet he could not speak. By dawn, he was gone, the first victim of centuries of inherited sin. The household whispered with unease. Servants noticed patterns, illness striking suddenly, always among family members, never among them. Some feared disease, others suspected curse, but none dared voice suspicion aloud. Evangeline moved among them with a disarming calm, offering gentle words, light touches, subtle warnings that kept them obedient. "The family is fragile," she murmured one morning. "Illness spares none, and pride is often punished before age claims us." Her influence extended silently. Every glance, every gesture, every quiet smile became a thread in the intricate tapestry of vengeance. Even the loyal and wary servants became unwitting instruments of her plan, delivering meals, pouring drinks, and carrying out her will without understanding its dark purpose. The storm had begun in earnest, rain lashing against the stone walls of Marrow Hall, wind howling through the chimneys like the cries of restless spirits. Evangeline ascended the narrow attic stairs, each step creaking under her weight, her black gown brushing against the wood, carrying with it the faint scent of lavender and smoke from the fireplace below. The attic was a tomb of forgotten memories, trunks stacked haphazardly, cobwebs draping over old furniture, the musty scent of decay mixed with the lingering perfume of a bygone era. Here, in this neglected sanctuary of dust and shadows, Evangeline found the letters, brittle, yellowed, and curling at the edges. They were the confessions and curses of her ancestors, written in haste or desperation, detailing a lineage steeped in cruelty. Each letter was a fragment of a puzzle, a roadmap of betrayal and revenge that had been buried beneath centuries of silence. One letter, penned by a great-grandmother whose eyes had haunted Evangeline's dreams since childhood, caught her attention. The handwriting was uneven, trembling, but the message was clear: this family will never escape the shadow of its sins. Each generation will bleed until justice is claimed. And should one rise with knowledge and resolve, the curse will find completion. Evangeline traced the words with her pale fingers, feeling the weight of centuries pressing against her heart. The storm outside mirrored the tempest within her mind, each gust of wind and clap of thunder echoing the reckoning that had been centuries in the making. She could almost hear the whispers of those who had died before her, their voices mingling with the wind, pleading, accusing, demanding balance. For hours she read, absorbing every detail, every subtle act of cruelty her ancestors had committed: the uncle who poisoned a rival for inheritance, the father who starved a servant's child to maintain order, the aunt who had hoarded wealth while watching the village suffer famine. These letters did more than recount events, they revealed the mindset, the arrogance, the callous disregard for life. They were a mirror of the bloodline itself, reflecting all that had to be corrected. By the time the candles flickered low, casting elongated shadows across the attic, Evangeline had made a decision. This knowledge was not just a revelation, it was a guide. Every victim, every act of poison, every subtle manipulation she had executed thus far, was part of a symphony, a slow, deliberate composition of justice. The storm outside softened into a mournful drizzle as she descended the stairs, clutching the letters to her chest. The weight of history was now a weapon, and she wielded it with precision and patience. The servants moved silently through the halls below, unaware that their mistress carried within her hands the echoes of centuries, the power to reshape fate. Evangeline's eyes glinted with determination. Justice was no longer a whisper, it was imminent, and the shadows of Marrow Hall were ready to obey her command. By early spring, Marrow Hall was no longer merely the seat of a wealthy family, it had become a theater of unease. The county had begun to notice the string of tragedies that had befallen the family: sudden illnesses, untimely deaths, whispered disappearances. The villagers, who had long spoken in hushed tones of Marrow Hall's shadowed corridors, now began to speculate with trembling voices. And yet, the source of their fear remained invisible, wrapped in a lady's serene composure and the mansion's forbidding architecture. The magistrate arrived one overcast afternoon, a man meticulous in dress and manner, carrying an air of authority softened by curiosity. Evangeline welcomed him with grace, guiding him through the halls with a calm smile that belied the storm within her. Every gesture, every word, was calculated. "The family has always been delicate," she murmured, her voice like velvet draped over steel. "Perhaps the recent illnesses are merely the consequences of age and neglect. Merrow Hall has always demanded vigilance, but illness spares no one." Weeks later, Evangeline orchestrated a final gathering, a dinner both ceremonial and deceptive. The long table, polished to a dark gleam, was laden with dishes designed to impress, with aromas carefully chosen to distract and delight. Candles burned low, their wax dripping onto ornate silver holders, casting flickering shadows that stretched across the walls like reaching fingers. The family arrived in their finest attire, unaware that every bite, every sip, was a silent instrument in Evangeline's symphony of vengeance. Conversations were careful, polite, measured, yet each laugh, each boast, was subtly twisted by the lady's keen observation. She noted who lingered too long over wine, who hesitated over conversation, who cast glances of suspicion. Each detail would matter. As the night wore on, the poison worked its silent magic. Ambrose's younger siblings, previously untouched, began to pale, their energy waning. The tension in the room became tangible, a thick, suffocating fog that clung to the walls and tablecloths. The servants, silent observers, moved about efficiently, unaware of the invisible hand shaping fate. Evangeline sat at the head of the table, her posture immaculate, her gaze calm. She watched the final airs falter, their eyes widening with disbelief, their bodies succumbing to the centuries-old reckoning she had orchestrated. In that moment, she was not merely a lady, she was the embodiment of justice long denied, a shadow of history manifesting in silk and poison. By midnight, the last of them lay in silent slumber, and the house, once alive with voices and laughter, fell into a profound and eerie quiet. The wind outside whispered through the chimneys, and Evangeline allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Every thread had been woven perfectly, the tapestry of vengeance was complete. Weeks later, Evangeline orchestrated a final gathering, a dinner both ceremonial and deceptive. The long table, polished to a dark gleam, was laden with dishes designed to impress, with aromas carefully chosen to distract and delight. Candles burned low, their wax dripping onto ornate silver holders, casting flickering shadows that stretched across the walls like reaching fingers. The family arrived in their finest attire, unaware that every bite, every sip, was a silent instrument in Evangeline's symphony of vengeance. Conversations were careful, polite, measured, yet each laugh, each boast, was subtly twisted by the lady's keen observation. She noted who lingered too long over wine, who hesitated over conversation, who cast glances of suspicion. Each detail would matter. As the night wore on, the poison worked its silent magic. Ambrose's younger siblings, previously untouched, began to pale, their energy waning. The tension in the room became tangible, a thick, suffocating fog that clung to the walls and tablecloths. The servants, silent observers, moved about efficiently, unaware of the invisible hand shaping fate. Evangeline sat at the head of the table, her posture immaculate, her gaze calm. She watched the final airs falter, their eyes widening with disbelief, their bodies succumbing to the centuries-old reckoning she had orchestrated. In that moment, she was not merely a lady, she was the embodiment of justice long denied, a shadow of history manifesting in silk and poison. By midnight, the last of them lay in silent slumber, and the house, once alive with voices and laughter, fell into a profound and eerie quiet. The wind outside whispered through the chimneys, and Evangeline allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Every thread had been woven perfectly, the tapestry of vengeance was complete. Morning came like a pale ghost, the sun struggling to penetrate the fog that clung stubbornly to the hills. Merrow Hall was silent, save for the crackle of the fireplace and the faint dripping of rain through the eaves. Evangeline walked through the rooms, her black gown flowing like ink across the polished floors. She paused before each bed, each chair, each portrait, observing the absence of life that now filled every corner. Outside, the county murmured with curiosity and fear. Rumors spread of sudden illness, of tragedy, of a family undone overnight. No one suspected the truth, that the lady they had always admired for her composure and refinement had orchestrated it all with deliberate, unerring precision. Evangeline's eyes, cold and reflective, followed the sunlight as it illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. She thought of her ancestors, their arrogance and cruelty, their greed and betrayal. All had been balanced, all debts paid. The curse, long whispered about in shadows and fearful tones, had been fulfilled. For the first time in her life, the weight of her heritage felt manageable. The house, once heavy with guilt and malice, now seemed almost purified. Yet even in this calm, a whisper of foreboding lingered, the knowledge that history always leaves traces, that echoes of the past never truly vanish. Alone in the soft dawn, Evangeline walked the halls of Marrow Hall with a calm that bordered on eerie. The wind swept through the trees outside, rustling the leaves in a sound that felt almost like applause, or a warning. The servants, now fully aware of the tragedies but too fearful to question her, moved silently, their eyes cast downward. She paused at the grand window, overlooking the fog-cloaked valley, and allowed herself a single, contemplative sigh. Some sins demand reckoning, some legacies are too dark to endure, and some women, patient, calculated, and refined, carry within them the patience of centuries. Waiting, watching, shaping fate. Lady Evangeline Marrow had done what no one else could, she had become the hand of destiny itself. The Marrow curse, feared and whispered about for generations, had finally found its executor. And in the silence of the dawn, with the mansion standing tall and unyielding behind her, she understood fully that shadows can shape history, and justice, no matter how delayed, is inexorable. Marrow Hall would remain, as it always had, a monument to power, cruelty, and elegance. And she, the quiet, unassuming lady, would remain its most enduring shadow, an eternal reminder that some legacies are written not in ink, but in patience, precision, and the quiet certainty of vengeance.